She grew up in a conservative home and was a rebel from an early age. She wrote songs that had music and a message. Now she's telling her story in a bid to turn the tide against rape. My guest on Under the Skin is Jennifer Ferguson. Jennifer Ferguson, welcome to Under the Skin.
Thank you, John.
What gave you the courage and clarity to say last October publicly that you'd been raped and to name the person that you were accusing of this?
I think it had a lot to do with this window that opened with #MeToo. Globally, I think women felt that they had this moment in time to speak the unspeakable. But when I took, after I'd put out the first post, I went to sleep that night, and I'm a meditative practitioner. I go into silence and I ask if there are big questions. I ask for guidance and help from the power greater than me. And when I woke up the next morning, it was really like a place beyond choice that I gave his name.
And were you alone in that moment, sitting at your laptop or your computer?
Completely. I was in my bed, and it was close. I woke up, and it was, we spoke a little bit about like having your quiet time when you wake up, not onto your media, but the phone was there, the phone's the alarm. So in a way, the kind of accessibility of it also, there was a kind of flow of ease in it was welcomed. It welcomed my unspeakable articulation, then.
And did you go to family, your husband, Anders, perhaps, and say, this is what I've done, or did you just let it be?
No, then I told my children, my sons, I told Anders, and of course, no, I can say also the part of naming Danny was what he represented. And knowing that the culture, that the Zuma culture, the Kwezi story, the fact that there probably were other women, that if we don't stand up and confront it, who's going to do it? What can we... So it was also this feeling of both Danny and I being kind of symbols in this time, that I've been gifted with some kind of a platform, with a voice. Many of the majority of women, and predominantly black women of color's screams are not heard. So how do I use this? And this is the kind of stuff that came up afterwards also. How do I use this space that's been created? Not as a strategy. It wasn't created strategically.
Yes.
It's consequentially. So what do I make of it afterwards? And that's been really the really difficult journey afterwards.
Jennifer, it's really interesting what you're saying, because inevitably this leads to wider campaigns like #MeToo, #WeToo, your own, which we'll talk about a little bit later. On another level, though, this is intensely personal, and it involves a calling to account and a looking in the eye between two individuals.
Yeah.
How do you see the balance in that? Because it seems to me you're trying to do both, and I'm wondering how hard it is.
No, you're really accurate with that, John. It's very astute, because if I look at Tarana Burke, her #MeToo was born really out of her personal experience, her own suffering, and the fact that she couldn't meet this young girl who asked for she kind of denied a young girl in trouble, and this spurred the #MeToo, predominantly for women of color, but survivors, not focused on the perpetrator. So this MeToo kind of, when it escalated into the Hollywood kind of viral thing, it's also like she planted a seed, the tree started growing, and it became a forest. So for me, also this thing of feminist activism is often rooted in a very excruciating personal narrative that involves suffering. And when women can take that our whole history in South Africa, where women are facing the bulldozers on a cold June night.
During forced removals.
Yes, and their shanties are being broken down, their kids, they've got nothing, and they take off their clothes. They take off and they stand naked before bulldozers. Those are images of our struggle, These are icons. So in a way, for me, what I'm doing is I'm doing this much of a huge tradition that I'm in awe of. And how do I, as an activist for social justice, serve this vast majority of unheard and also activism that has been on the field for a long time? This is nothing new. How do I serve that? How do I serve my artistry that uses everything as grist for the mill beyond the fields of right and wrong? And my spirituality that seeks to recognize, like we did through Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the humane and the redeemable in the worst spaces of violation.
If #WeToo and other movements like it were to become huge and successful and really make an impact, obviously that would meet a big part of what you've just described. But would there be a part of you, Jennifer Ferguson, that needed some bringing to closure an account with the man you've accused of raping you?
Yeah.
Would that be true by extrapolation, perhaps, for every woman who's been raped?
Yeah, completely. I mean, this is the kind of playing field now. I'm playing extensive consultations with legal organizations, with NGOs working with sexual violence, with survivors. And at the same time, my own need I was doing via Skype, a very fine transpersonal psychologist, at last entering the sort of post-traumatic counseling and processing that I needed to do to unlock what was a kind of a freeze of memory on many levels. I'm a diarist, and I didn't write this thing even. I was so ashamed of what had happened. I was so ashamed of my own lack of power in the situation. I was so ashamed of where I had not read signals, where I'd acted in trust,
Yes.
So when you start sort of unpacking these things, and I think that's where many women feel like somehow I caused it to have to blame. Shame is based on that sense of blame, and it's a deep thing. And I'm a woman empowered. I've got resources. I've done a lot of personal work. I'm well read. I've got so many resources, And if you take other people that are not, how do we begin to deal with this very, very complicated thing of sexual behavior, sexual interrelating that is distorted?
Danny Jordaan, through his lawyers, denied your story. He said that mediation, which you'd proposed, would look like a cover-up, said that a court of law was the best place to establish the truth. You have spoken on the one hand of a possible civil claim, but also some engagement in a restorative process between you and him and perhaps others. The latter would be essentially private. Would that be your preference ultimately?
He hasn't taken ownership of the story at all. If he was innocent, within the first 24 hours of that social media thing, he could have hit me with a defamation completely. I was so vulnerable there.
Yes.
He didn't. He waited, and that's been his modus operandi. So I've got this thing, this kind of what happens to people when they get into power, and power corrupts considerably. And on the other hand, a very deep desire to honor the commitment to maintaining our humanity and meeting as people, coming out of Khotla tradition, for example, out of our TRC processes, be they flawed. But how do we do this? How do we find other ways of mending? Maybe he can come forward, take ownership of what is a problematic sexual behavior. Maybe say, I don't actually understand the concept of consent. I don't know what that means, But maybe if I'm dealing with myself, and maybe I can be a spokesperson for a lot of men in our country. That would be my life.
But you want an end to the silence.
Yeah, I want an end.